let's go through some of the features and a couple methods for utilizing the Abbey saw guide. So, first of the features is the diameter of tubing that the saw guide is going to work with. The smallest diameter is going to be 7/8 of an inch or 22.2 millimeters, and the largest is going to be 1 1/8 inch or 28.6 millimeters. The second feature is the saw guide's been designed to work with two common types of blades that we're going to utilize for cutting a handlebar or a steer tube. And one side of the saw guide's got a narrow blade slot, and that's designed to work with a traditional toothed hacksaw blade for shortening up metal items. And the opposite side of that has got a wider saw guide slot, and that's designed to work with the abrasive style carbon fiber compatible hacksaw blades. So those on there. And when you're going to use your saw guide, you can clamp it in the bench vise or use it with parts mounted to the bike. So shortening handlebar or steer tube on the bike. So we'll go through a few different ways to utilize the tool, and more directly, what type of measurement are we using and how can we use the tool for alignment purposes. So the first of the two measurements I'm going to call out is an exact measurement. So I've got a handlebar here, carbon fiber handlebar, and say the customer wants this handlebar cut down to 700 millimeters. We can use the graphics marked onto the handlebars, or you can measure them yourself, whatever your choice is. I prefer the latter of the two, but for demonstration purposes here, we'll just use the marking on the handlebar from the manufacturer. So I've got a carbon fiber handlebar. I'm going to make sure I use the wider slot for identifying and making my cut. Now, what I'm going to do here is, for alignment purposes, I've got my real clear indication on the handlebar, and I'm going to use that indication on the handlebar and align it with the inside of the wider slot on the saw guide. Or you can consider that as just aligning your mark with the body of the saw guide. So I'm going to get that, and as always, just confirm you're going to get your cut in the right spot. So it looks like I've got to slide on just a little bit further. Drop that saw blade back on there. Yep, that looks really nice. And once you're happy with the location of the guide relative to the item being cut, just go ahead and make sure your set screws are nice and tight. And go ahead and drop your saw in there and let the saw blade do the work for you. So that was cutting to an exact mark. The second way we can utilize the saw guide and as a part of the cutting exercise is, if we're going to cut a steer tube to length, building a brand new bike, brand new forks going onto that bike, or you're shortening the steer tube up for a customer once they've determined their position on a bike. What we're going to end up with, and I've got a steer tube that's marked for this, is we're going to end up with, in this case, a mark that I'm going to refer to as the top of the stack. So my stack will be my headset, bearings, compression wedge, top cap, spacers, the stem, and then if you decide to place a stem on top, or place a spacer on top of the stem, that spacer. So this was set up with a spacer on top of the stem. I compressed the system as best I could, just snugged my stem to hold things in place, and I marked the top of that spacer with a thick permanent marker there. Now, so I've got a top of stack mark. What I'm going to do now is slide my saw guide on, and once I get it in place, what I'm going to use, and I'm going to use my top of stack mark, but because my marker is pretty thick, I'm actually going to end up using the bottom of that mark, or the marking from my permanent marker there. So I'm going to use the bottom of that mark, and I'm going to align the bottom of that mark up with the outside face of the saw guide. In this case, I've got an aluminum steer tube, so I've got the narrower blade slot in the guide set up, and I can just come in and verify that that's lined up really nicely. And it looks good there. And by setting the saw guide up in this position for shortening a steer tube, what I'm going to end up with is removing 3 or 4 millimeters below the bottom of my stack mark, or think of it in the context of this is assembled. If I remove 3 or 4 millimeters below where I was able to mark it, I'm recessing down inside that top spacer, giving me enough space to be able to compress the system properly when it goes together. So I'm happy with that mark. Snug that up, in this case clamp it into a bench vise and make my cut there. If you are using the saw guide in a bench vise, particularly with a fork, is think about some way to be able to support the fork at the axle end to keep it from drooping a little bit. That'll help to get you a really nice square cut with the saw guide on there. So exact mark, or in the case of a steer tube, top of stack mark. You can also use the exact mark method if you know an exact value for your steer tube to be cut. Now with those, next up we'll show you how we can use the saw guide on parts that are currently mounted onto a bike. Let's go through the removal of some steer tube that has, in this case, a piece of housing, but it could be a brake hose, piece of housing, electronic wire passing through it. This technique is also really great to be able to use if it's just a fork you're going to remove some extra steer tube from that's still mounted onto the bike. So what I've done is I've removed the green clamping jaw and 2 set screws from the saw guide. I'm going to slide it onto my steer tube. I've got a mark on my steer tube that's indicating the 10 millimeters that I intend to remove from it. And what I'm going to do for alignment is I'm going to use the inside, or the body side of the saw blade slot to align with my hacksaw. So I've got to come down a good bit there to be able to get this in a good position. And come back and check my location again. Just a touch more. Now, pretty obvious that this is a little mock-up here, and it's a piece of brake housing passing through here. But one additional step you may want to take in working with the saw guide and having some things passing internally on the steer tube is wrapping that with some material, or just putting a small protective barrier between the housing or electronic wire or hose and the saw blade itself. So my alignment looks good. I'm going to go ahead and snug up my set screws on the saw guide. And what I'm going to do first is cut through 80 to 90% of the steer tube. And once I get through that, I'll come back and take a look at how we can reposition both the saw guide and the hacksaw at the same time to maintain our alignment, and that'll allow us to finish off the last 10 to 20% of steer tube and end up with a nice cut that's ready to be finished and get the bike back together and ready to ride. So I made my initial cut in the steer tube using the saw guide, and prior to making that cut I did wrap in this case the housing with a little bit of protective tape. Now as I was making the first cut, I did pivot the hacksaw blade to move a little bit closer to the housing on one side, push the housing over, and then also cut a bit towards the second side. So I've cut through a little more than 80% of the steer tube. And to complete my cut, what I'm going to do is use the hacksaw blade and the saw guide together to maintain alignment. So I'm going to loosen up one of the set screws on the saw guide itself and just rotate or pivot the 2 around together. Come back and tighten that set screw on the saw guide. Find some way to, again, to be able to move that housing out of the way to hopefully minimize any potential damage. And once I've made the cut all the way through this section of steer tube, then I've got to consider the best path or best course of action to remove that section of steer tube from the bike, considering I still have the brake hose or derailleur housing or electronic wire passing through it. So this could be a case of trying to use, if you've got some heavy-duty tin snips, or maybe you've got a Dremel tool or a grinder that you can do it very carefully with. But it would be terrible to go through and cut all the steer tube and make a nice clean cut and then damage the brake hose or derailleur housing or electronic wire when you're trying to remove that last little section of steer tube from the bike. So take your time on this portion, get everything finished up and cleaned up real nice, and get the bike back together and ready to go back to your customer or for yourself and enjoy it.